Welcome back, everybody. So we're going to begin the second half of our workshop, which is a panel discussion. And we have the three previous speakers from the first part, plus three more who will introduce themselves. And Vincent Gogolek from the BC Freedom of Information and Privacy Association will be moderating. And we hope to be able to take questions as we go, if they're pertinent to the discussion at hand, but we'll definitely have some time for Q&A at the end. So do write notes, mark down your questions, and prepare to converse.
Well, I'm going to start off up here, but I'm going to be a free-range moderator, so I'm going to be running around a little bit. And just wanted to say, first of all, that this is a pretty impressive panel, but what's really impressive is the report that BCCLA have managed to come up with the minimal amount of information that the government of British Columbia and others have been made available to them. I think it's been outstanding. So, if I had it off to you guys, it's just been truly an impressive accomplishment. So I guess based on what Micheal was talking about in terms of transformed government, I guess the next conference is going to be Government by Transformers, Autobots or Decepticons. But waiting for that happy day and the Michael Bay movie that'll go along with it. I'm just going to let we're going to start with Chris Parsons from University of Victoria. He's going to lead us off because he's going to be able to fill you in with some more details on how this card actually is supposed to work. Brad Weldon from the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner is going to follow up with some thoughts from the Office of She Who Regulates this kind of stuff. And, of course, Andrew Clement, who will also be summing up what we've learned this afternoon. So, first off, over to you, Chris. Your choice.
So thank you for coming. What I'm going to do is just go through some of the report that myself and my colleague Adam Molnar put together. Our report was commissioned by the BCCLA, and what our mandate was to look at the publicly available information concerning the services card based on documents provided by BC FIPA. We also, as part of our methodology, looked at other documents around identity cards that seemed pertinent. We looked at academic research, and we conducted expert-level interviews. So we did meet with a member of the OCIO's office. We also consulted with health and e-card specialists around the country to discuss some of the challenges that they'd run into and some of the things that they were mindful of in their own deployment. So our report, as a result, actually isn't as detailed as what we just saw around the technical elements of what an ID card looks like. And that's simply because we don't have that level of transparency. So instead what we did is we looked at what was available, and then we provided the BCCLA with a summary of prospective threats that could come up with this kind of technology, this kind of identity infrastructure. So what I'm going to do is just briefly go through some of the highlights. So I'm not going to dig into sort of the specifications of how NFC chips and the near-field communications chips work, or the details of cryptography or something like that, although we do note some of those things in the report. So I'm going to start by actually noting why this matters. So this is a card that will be used ostensibly to access your medical records, and that's really important. It's very personal information. But that's the beginning. This is a card that is meant to attach other government services as times go on. Your children's education information, your access to social services, prospectively even the ability to vote. And moreover, it's also intended as a proto-Canadian identity card in the sense that it's meant to interoperate with federal systems. The company, the vendor that is providing this, has the intention of wrapping up Canada. Now, why does that matter beyond the fact that it's a large number of services? From a security standpoint, it means that it's a high-value target. Not just the card, but the infrastructure behind the card. The card is what you will carry in your wallet, and that's important. But what's really important is the government data linking system that sits behind that card. Information about that infrastructure, about the database system, about the security that's provided there is not available. We have requested it and have been told that that isn't available to us for security reasons. On the one hand, you can appreciate that. Hiding things is a good way of making sure you don't know what's there to break. But in many security fields, really the best way of doing security is to have open, provable models, letting them be tested, and ensuring that even in the face of that kind of attack, that kind of well-interested attack, it remains secure. To date, that unfortunately doesn't seem to have happened. So what were some of the highlights of what we looked at? We began actually just by looking at what it means to get the card. What happens when you show up at an ICBC kiosk? You say, okay, it's time to register. Well, it's going to look a lot like when you get your driver's license taken, actually. They're going to take a biometric photo. That's then going to be juxtaposed against ICBC's existing photo database. Now, okay, we've seen movies, 24, that sounds pretty great. Except currently ICBC has a 25 to 27% hit rate. That means a little over a quarter of the time they think that you might be impersonating someone else, or their system has identified you as possibly looking exactly like someone else. It's then sent to post-secondary screening. It's evaluated to see, do you actually look like the person who we think you might also look like? And then, you get currently your driver's license issued, you'll have your health card or your services card issued. But there's a problem with that. And we've pushed ICBC. I've been pushing ICBC on this for several years. How exactly do you evaluate the confidence in your data? What does that mean? Well, when I, Chris Parsons, show up and a photo is taken of me, what happens when I show up again? Do you catch me? It's challenging to do that. It's often a manual process to start figuring out how it works. The best group in Canada that's been doing this work in the public sense is the Ontario Lottery Gaming Corporation. They use this kind of analysis, and it's not accurate. It's not 100% accurate, I should say. It's accurate enough for their purposes. But here what we're talking about is your biometric template is meant as a primary means of guaranteeing to the government that when you show up with whatever documents you have, that you're a unique person applying for a unique identifier. We still don't know the efficacy of the biometric analysis. That's a problem. It's not to say it doesn't work, but we don't know. The other challenge is documentary verification. This is true of all the existing documents. We haven't seen anything from ICBC in particular that really rigorously goes through and maps how exactly they're going to be guaranteeing that the breeder documents that you bring, your birth certificate, your social insurance number, how do they evaluate the veracity of those? What are the mechanisms by which they identify fraudulent document issuance? These systems exist, but we have no transparency into how they work. And why does that matter? It matters because this is the first line of making sure you are who you say you are, and then issuing an identity credential. So we need to know that it's being issued properly. And throughout, bad actors is a real concern. At the point of issuance, we have to know that the people who are involved in that issuance are not conspiring against the system. They're not in the hands, or they're not being paid, or they have been infiltrated somehow by third parties, either through bribes or whatever else. And indeed, when I spoke to colleagues in Ontario about this is a recognized problem of bad actors at front counters, and it's a devilish challenge they're trying to deal with to this date, many years after they've implemented a similar system for their driver's licenses. So that's just enrollment. Another thing we looked at was the physical card, and really there's an awful lot on the card that is, to my mind at least, non-offensive. They want to add a photo. They want to add card proofing capabilities, and that just means it's harder to copy. And so when you show up, and you show your card, they can look at the picture, they can look at you, and they can start evaluating, yeah, this is probably you. They can also test to make sure that the holographs are in the proper place, that the unique images are in the right location. Basic elements of ensuring that the document is valid. But none of these physical measures are perfect. They can and will be defeated over time in the face of an interested attacker. Security, no matter what anyone tells you, is not about building an impenetrable wall. That just doesn't exist. It's about building as many obstacles so that it is so onerous to beat those obstacles that whatever you get at the end of beating it isn't worth the effort. And so here it's important that these physical measures are recognized as helpful, important, building barriers, but they will be beaten, or they could be beaten. And indeed, academic researchers and technical researchers have analyzed identity documents, and there are more and more places all over the world with incredibly talented scientists, China, India, where you can send identity documents, and they can be analyzed, often as an academic or a research purpose, and then those findings are given perhaps to parties that you may not want that information, how to break it, how to replicate it, is made available to them. So as this card is more widely used, as it is more useful as an identity token both in this province and this country, it's a more valuable document. So beating those basic physical protections is more helpful. I mean, you can imagine if a driver's license is only good for, driving a particular model of a car, cloning it may not be the most valuable thing. But if it's used for all sorts of other government functions, which it is, all of a sudden buying a fake, becomes much more interesting, both to if you just want to drink, to if you want to have fraudulent identity to receive other benefits or something like that. So one of the key components of this, one of what I find one of the more concerning elements of the physical card itself, happens to be the chip that's installed in it. This chip will not have all of your medical information. It will not have all of your driving information. It will not. This isn't like your life on a couple kilobytes. Instead, what it's going to have is a unique number, and it's going to have a function in it that verifies when the card is read by an authorized reader that indeed the chip is true, it's valid, it's authentic. The aim of this is to minimize, from the government's perspective, this is their argument, to minimize the personal information. It's just a number. And to also verify that this number is still valid. The chip is still good. We haven't revoked it. The issue is that NFC chips, which are being used now, they're becoming increasingly widespread. If you have one of the new Visa cards or MasterCards that lets you use sort of wave your card, it's that kind of technology. As more and more identity documents adopt NFC chips, there are more and more researchers, academic and non-academic, who are just interested in breaking them to see how they break, why they break, and how to replicate them breaking. And so a strong reliance on the chip itself may seem sensible at the moment. I want to stress may. But 5 years out, it is less clear because security advances and attacks on these systems advance so rapidly. And indeed, colleagues of mine are currently looking for postdocs to do this kind of work because it's a really interesting academic project and it can help industry to figure out what goes wrong. But this is just an indication of small amounts of money just because people are curious without a financial drive to actually break it. The aim on the whole with a physical card is what happens when the chip doesn't read properly. So on one hand, we could have a service denial. You don't get health services. I'm sorry, it doesn't validate. Or there are secondary methods by which you can evaluate. Does the holograph check out? Is it embossed properly? Do you look like the photo? And then you get cleared through secondary means. And that's an entirely reasonable thing when you need health service, when you need to access whatever. But it also creates the possibility that if you have a card that has a knowingly bad chip, you're still using it, and through a little bit of social engineering can still get access to services. Because if the card itself isn't, and the validation of the chip isn't a requirement to receive service, then there's the possibility of doing an end run around that key security element to make sure that your card is real and this card identifies you. In the report, we note that the public internet is being used to transport some of this information. It is encrypted. It uses the same kind of security that is used when you access your bank. I've done research with colleagues, and there's a wide community doing research here. It's important to have that kind of security that your bank offers, called SSL, the little lock when you access secure websites, but it is far from infallible. In fact, it's very weak. It's very easy to get around in the face of a dedicated party. So it could be a problem, but we don't actually think it is. Neither Adam or I see this as a key way of breaking very much. More worrisome, however, is exactly the issue that was brought up around denial of service attacks. What happens when particular elements of the government's infrastructure are targeted and you can no longer access them? So this comes in two different dimensions. One, with regards to the card, what happens when key elements that are verifying your identity electronically are no longer accessible? How does that work? We haven't seen documents that identify from government how they've planned for that contingency. The other issue is, as the government moves to an increasingly interlinked system. So remember, the card is the symbol, an important symbol, but there's a whole data linkage architecture happening behind the scenes. What happens even if you don't access your card, even if you don't verify your service? What happens if you just start targeting various elements of the government infrastructure? So this isn't an issue necessarily exclusively with the card, although it certainly is for verification and authentication, but it's just a general concern around the management and the protection of citizen information and citizen services in the province. So I just want to turn to the last piece. So it's going to focus on the chip a little bit more. So it's the same as you're going to find in most smart cards. And most literature that you will read from the government, and indeed most literature from vendors, truth be told, they'll identify that it has a very small read range. It's meant to be a few centimeters. And in proper conditions, that's true. However, it's possible to access that information from a distance. It uses what's called a relay attack, and I won't get into all the bits and pieces, but it is feasible, entirely feasible, to access that unique number I mentioned earlier. And that's because, now we've had back and forth and back and around about a little bit with the government, the number itself is not supposed to be encrypted. It's a plain text number. And so that means that you can extract the number and then you can embed it on an NFC chip. It won't check out. It won't necessarily verify. But you can go through and you can establish a whole series of pieces of the card to make it look as legitimate as possible. To say, well, I don't know what's wrong, but it checks out. So it can be read from a distance. There's also a very, you would hope it's juvenile, but you'll sort of hope it isn't. Because it's a wireless card, it's possible to jam the cards. And indeed, there are public products you can buy online right now that have a range of not a huge distance. You can imagine someone that just wants to be, childish in a school where these are meant to be deployed in part, who wants to just be a pain. And it sounds like, well, who's going to do that? It costs about $100 right now, and the prices will just go down. So is it a primary major threat? Maybe not necessarily, but it's something to be mindful of. There is a extensive supply chain involved in these cards. So there's a series of vendors. This is absolutely normal for government work. But it does mean that the supply chain security has to be kept pretty tight. We don't want to say it isn't. We don't know. We don't have any documents, and it wasn't a primary area of our research. But it's important to note that making sure that the chips are secure, the card stock is secure, the facilities are secure, it's critical. Again, if the cards can be forged, they can be captured, then one of the physical key mechanisms can be masqueraded. And then the point that this is what I would do if I were wanting to be a pain. I would happily not receive government services if I wanted to attack the system. I would get a card and I would make it look as real as possible. And I would put an NFC chip in it. One of the problems with NFC chips and the government's plan to move to consumer devices to read these, so this phone is something that they want to use to access the card, to access government services, to make it easy for citizens, and that makes sense. But what happens when I give it a false card, and when it reads the chip, it then launches a website that installs malware on your phone, or on a government computer, or your home computer? So, ignoring the fact that how secure is the database, can I actually use the card as an attack vector to compromise your own devices with your personal information? We raised this as a possibility with the OCIO, and it was outside of what they considered. It's an important piece, because you can imagine you go to a hospital, you wave it by your computer where you have your tax information. There are all sorts of different scenarios where it would be advantageous to take control of that environment, to be able to read what you're doing, what's on that device. I guess actually there is one last piece on the NFC chip. This won't solve computer security. Why does that matter? Because if you're accessing your computer from home, do you know who controls your computer? I don't say this to be fear-mongering. 2 years ago, I was watching a conference, and the head of Bell Cybersecurity gave a talk. And one of his slides was about a 15th of Bell's entire consumer base. Their computer is controlled by malware. So the people who own those computers, they can access their email, they can access their banking information, they can do whatever they want. But there's another party that they strongly believe actually has administrative control over those computers. And so when people are accessing banking information, when they are accessing their health information or whatever else they have on their computer, someone else can also look at it. So the BC Services Card, you may, if it works, authenticate to the government. But it still doesn't resolve the fact that your computer itself may not be a safe device. And indeed, if you have an Android phone, unless you've bought sort of a developer edition, it has many, many bugs that everyone knows are there, that Google has patched, but your carrier, Rogers, Bell, has not patched for you. There are known points of attack in these devices. So moving to consumer environments, while appealing to deliver government services, and I appreciate that, does have concerns along with it. And so the recommendations, I mean, Kate's gone through them. This is something that really requires public debate. Do we need these cards? Why do we need these cards? What are the policy drivers? How do we measure success? That seems simple from a political scientist where I spend a lot of my time. How do we measure success in the policy? It's changed so many times, it's hard to figure that out. Moreover, it's incredibly important that the BC government make available the technical infrastructure for experts to go and hammer at. If we're going to not have any public debate about the democratic legitimacy of the card, we damn well better have security experts work and work and work on it. And unfortunately, thus far, we haven't even seen that. If this is going to be a technocratic process, which I don't want, I'm not appealing for that, but if we're going to do that, can we at least get that right? It doesn't seem like it's happening so far. So I'll turn it over.
Well, it's good that Chris ended talking about the need for consultation, the need for more information, because we're fortunate to have with us today Brad Weldon from the Office of the Information Privacy Commissioner, who, in her report on the card, has said, yeah, you better be doing some consultation on this. And I think I will let Mr. Weldon tell us what they have in mind.
Thanks, Vince. So I'm with the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. I'm a policy analyst. The current Information and Privacy Commissioner is Elizabeth Denham. She's about halfway through her term. And privacy has been a large focus of her tenure as an Information and Privacy Commissioner. So it was alluded to earlier that there's sort of two sides of a coin. You have the information side, the freedom of information side, and then the protection of privacy side. Freedom of information is we're talking about access to government information. And then there's the protection of privacy, or generally talking about your personal information. That's the side that I'm mainly focused on. I was involved in our office's review of the BC Services Card. It was a condensed process. There was an awful lot of documents coming our way in a short period of time as it led up to going live. That said, we didn't feel by the end that there was something that we should have had that we weren't provided with, and I think part of the urgency and the volume of documents that happen quite close to it going live. It's just, I think, a natural consequence of a large project like this. As issues are discovered, they get resolved. Documents like security threat risk assessments and privacy impact assessments have to get reviewed and revised. So by the time we were done with phase 1, which doesn't deal with most of the issues that were discussed earlier with respect to the chip and the activation of the chip and the use of the chip, it mostly has to do with the infrastructure that exists behind the scenes between the various federated identities that Christian's model demonstrated, where you have ICBC as one of the identities, you have the Ministry of Health as another, and then the Office of the Chief Information Officer acting as an identity broker in the middle. That was mostly what our review focused on, and we were, by the end, quite comfortable with the privacy-sensitive steps taken by government to protect your personal information. We made some specific recommendations around security, and then our major recommendation really involved, again, as Vince said, transparency and public consultation with respect to the future phases of the project. So these are the phases where we're going to start potentially using the near-field chip in the card to access government services. Also phases where additional service providers may be coming on board, initially likely government agencies, like another government ministry, or perhaps crown corporations. And down the road, it's not unlikely that there won't be private sector agencies also accessing this as an authentication service. So I think early on, Micheal talked about two sort of large issues, I think, and one of them I think is bigger than the BC Services Card. It just has to do with the sharing of our personal information between silos, between government agencies, data sharing, data linking. This is a big issue and a big question that is being faced around the world, and certainly as more and more of our information becomes digital and can be easily manipulated and analyzed electronically, it becomes more and more compelling and tempting for government to share it and use it in novel ways. It's a fundamental privacy principle that your information should only be used for the purpose for which it was originally collected. And if that purpose is going to, if it is going to be put to a different purpose, then it either has to be authorized by law through a democratic process or by your consent. And so the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act, which is coming on to its 20-year anniversary in our province, has a set of authorizations within it where government can use information for different purposes. And our office has a role in oversight of data linking. So if you have an agency that wants to, say, review some information that was collected for one purpose and see if it accords with some other information they have, maybe because they're interested in determining whether or not you're eligible for a government service or perhaps not eligible, we have a role to play in reviewing the privacy impact assessment for how that is going to be done, whether it's done in a way that is privacy sensitive and whether it's done in a way that is fair to the individual. So this is, as I say, the broader information sharing issue, which a smaller sort of portion of that, I think, is the discussion around the BC Services Card. So the BC Services Card is, it can facilitate information sharing, but as it is currently implemented, it's mostly just an authentication service. So there's, I think, there is information that ICBC has about you, there's information that the Ministry of Health has about you, and to access certain pieces of that information, you have to use the BC Services Card as an authentication of who you are. But that's not to say that the information is being shared or linked. One of our focuses was to make sure that that wasn't the case, that Ministry of Health doesn't have access to ICBC information and ICBC doesn't have access to Ministry of Health information. So as it currently stands, there isn't information sharing occurring through the BC Services Card. It's providing this authentication service. And it's an interesting question whether or not it's appropriate for government to be setting up an authentication service. It is something that is necessary in our world. We need to be able to authenticate that we are who we say that we are. If we're going to access services or purchase services, if government doesn't take on that role, then it's entirely likely that the private sector will. We see that at Revenue Canada, you can log into your Revenue Canada identity and you can use your banking information as your authentication for who you say you are. So the federal government, to some extent, in that, or at least that department of the federal government has said, we're comfortable with the banking sector's authentication of who you are. We're not going to get into it. And I think it's interesting, a question to be asked, and I don't think it's an easy answer, who we're more comfortable being in charge of that role, whether we are comfortable with government taking it on or the private sector. And it's not like they are mutually exclusive. I'm sure there will be parallel systems. It's just a question of which one we end up using when we're accessing government services. So I think that the key factor as we move forward with this process is the one that the Commissioner really focused her recommendations on, which is just that the next steps where we do get into introducing new parties to the BC Services Card, perhaps using it when you go to the liquor store to prove that you're 19 or not. These are before these steps can be taken, we do need to involve the public in a comprehensive discussion about whether or not we need the card, and then if we do need the card, how we want the card to be built and how we want it to be designed to protect our privacy and then also to facilitate our access to these services. This is something that everybody has said so far has been practically non-existent with the first phase of the program. Government has agreed to all of our recommendations, from some of the sort of finite security recommendations through to this recommendation for a broad public consultation. At this point, I guess in the midst of an election and various other issues before government, there doesn't seem to be momentum towards the second phase. We anticipate that government will live up to their commitment to engage the public in the transparent consultation process once we do get back to the business of government, and we expect that we will once again be in the midst of detailed reviews of the security threat risk assessments, privacy impact assessments, and the privacy-sensitive policies and training policies the government has committed to putting in place. So I think that I've covered, as an introduction, most of the things that I wanted to discuss. One thing that I do want to do that is not necessarily related, but I did mention that it's the 20th anniversary of the Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy Act, which is the public sector privacy legislation that tells government how they can collect your personal information, what they can do with it, and then how they can disclose it. And leading up to the 20th anniversary, we have a conference happening here in Vancouver in October, and there's some of these cards are out on the various desks on the way in. It actually is a conference that we're calling Privacy and Access 2020. So 2020 as in obviously the 2020 vision, but then reflecting the 20-year anniversary, and it's going to be held here in Vancouver, and I encourage anybody who's interested in how their privacy is affected in both the public or private sectors to look into whether or not there are presenters in that conference that you may be interested in. So I'm open to, at some point, I'm sure you'll have plenty of opportunity to ask me questions, but I think that's all I have to say for now.
Which leads us with Andrew Clement from the University of Toronto. And he's just going to have a few words because he's going to be wrapping this whole thing up and telling us what we learned here today. I think we learned something here today is probably how he's going to begin. Andrew?
Okay, well, thank you. It's a delight to be here. I actually grew up in Vancouver and left 30 years ago, and I'm now returning to live here, so I feel it's kind of a homecoming. And what I wanted to do is just to put the developments around the BC Services Card in a sort of wider context of ID scheme developments around the world over the last few decades. Because I think what's happening here is, particularly interesting. It's highly problematic, but it follows some very familiar patterns. But at the same time, I think there's a tremendous opportunity. Knowing what we do about the card and the studies that have been done by the BCCLA and Kate and Chris and so on, and also drawing upon an extensive history of developments elsewhere, maybe we can do it right, because the field of ID scheme development is littered with failed projects that have been incredibly ambitious in scope but unspecified about what they're really supposed to do, and they falter for a whole lot of technical, practical, and political reasons. But I want to start just by talking a bit about why ID is important. And in some ways, maybe you don't need to be reminded of this too much, but I mean, most of us carry within our wallets a whole set of cards that, in effect, define who we are, who we can be, how we relate to the important institutions in our lives, our schools, our universities, our banks, our government, and memberships in clubs. And one of the exercises I do with my students is to get them to pull out their card, their wallet, and look at them. And many of them are shocked and surprised to see how many they have. And also, it is very revealing about who you are, what you can be, by what is in your car, in your wallet, and these ID cards. In a way, these are tokens of our contemporary life. You can read a person's biography through them. If these are compromised, on the other hand, you're in trouble. And I would dare say that for most of you, losing your wallet, it's much more serious, the ID that you get compromised, than the amount of money that may be lost in that. So your ID is fundamental to who you are, obviously in that term, very literally, but also in terms of who you are in relation to the government and the relationship between a citizen and the state, because increasingly the governments are called upon to being an arbiter of your identity, who you are, who you can be, how you relate to others. In that sense, particularly as we move increasingly to these digital systems, as we move online, these become a form of public infrastructure like electricity and other telecommunications. And we are building that now through these digital networks, but we're not paying attention, I would say, adequately to what's at stake. And that's where I think there's a tremendous opportunity in BC to look at that from a sort of critical and constructive point of view and build a public identity infrastructure that reflects our understandings of what it means to be a citizen in a democratic society, and to take part in that. If there's anything that we should have a right to shape as citizens, it's our identity scheme. It's who we are. It's our relationship to our government. And that is an opportunity that I think is desperately needed to be taken, and it's been squandered so many times. And of course, when I refer to these cards, I don't mean that it's the cards themselves that are so important, as others have mentioned. In a way, these are the tips of the iceberg of a large identity and database sort of shadow of us. These cards, almost all of them that you look at, have unique identifiers that connect you to your card and to a database that is then increasingly used to mediate questions of whether you get benefits or how you can travel and so on. And that also reflects a change in the way in which the ID is being developed. It used to be more that it was the card itself said you were a member, you were a Canadian or whatever, and you could look at the card itself and you would pass. Now it's that ID linkage that unique persistent identifier that's on the card or increasingly in our phones and so on, that then accesses to the database, and it's what's in the database that determines, who you can be, what services you get access to, what you're denied, and so on. Given this importance, the centrality of ID schemes, cards, and databases, and the telecommunications linkages between them, to the operation functioning in a contemporary society, it's not surprising that governments are turning increasingly to ID schemes for a whole range of social problems. In a way, it's not too simple to say that regardless of the problem, a better ID scheme is part of the solution. We saw that most dramatically after 9/11. Terrorists attack prominent sites. What's the solution? Immediately, within weeks, there was calls for national ID schemes. A Globe and Mail survey in Canada on the week of October 6th, so within a month, or was reported on the week of October 6th, 86% of Canadians said that they would be prepared to carry a national ID card and present that to the police upon request. That's a remarkable shift in attitude. It also reflects magical thinking, as if somehow having an ID card is going to make us safe. And I think there's some psychological explanations for that. Maybe we believe, or like to believe, that if we can show who we are, and we know we're innocent, others will accept us. But that is, I would say, a mistaken belief. But it's not just terrorism. Europe has an immigration problem. What do we do about immigrants? We fingerprint them and we create an ID scheme. It's efficient administration of government services in Britain, an ID scheme. Cutting fraud, ID scheme. You want to travel and be convenient? Carry a card. Again and again and again, the solutions to a whole range of sort of problems and opportunities is to develop better ID. And in some ways, these ID schemes are, I would say, the sort of holy grail of contemporary governance, good management, good administration. And so we keep seeing them come up again and again. On the other hand, as I was saying about the sort of magical thinking, there is often very little specification, clear specification of what do you really want to do with this. And Micheal was referring to this earlier. There's really very poor, sloppy thinking about precisely what the cards are supposed to do. And so they try, the position to be sort of all things to all people, but they often flounder. They're also, of course, incredibly lucrative to the businesses that want to sell infrastructures. Microsoft, of course, is very keen on that, IBM. They have developed some quite interesting solutions that go beyond what governments are asking them to do. And unfortunately, they're not the governments aren't paying attention to those options. But anyway, there's a great deal of push from vendors who want to sell ID infrastructure. It's very expensive. Given that kind of imperative, you would think that we would see much greater success in developing these. But over the past decades, particularly, I'll just use examples from Anglo-American, sort of English-speaking jurisdictions. In Australia, the Australia card proposal in the late 1980s caused a governmental crisis and a change in government around that. The UK has been promoting a variety of ID schemes since the 1990s. Most recently, in 2006, they finally passed the ID Cards Act. It went to the House of Lords 5 times and was turned back before it was allowed. They finally relented. I mean, it caused a near constitutional crisis, in part because these are it's politically controversial, and people have rightful concerns about the risks of putting their ID, all of their ID eggs in the basket of a huge national scheme. In the U.S., right after 9/11, lots of proposals around national ID. The most controversial one is the real ID, which many states have fought against and is not really fully implemented. This washed over into Canada in 2003. government then proposed a national ID card. The parliamentary committee looked at it. They turned it down because there wasn't enough clear evidence that they actually needed one, and the government stopped it. But then a few months later, they proceeded with another alternative. We've seen that the enhanced driver's license in British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, a couple of other provinces, being used as a border crossing card as a substitute for a passport. That did get implemented, but the uptake of that was much, much lower. It cost thousands of dollars per issued one just because of so much infrastructure, and there was very little clear value for them, no public consultation. Going back to the UK, more recently, when the coalition government came in 2010, the first thing they did, their first act, was to repeal the ID Cards Act, given how unpopular it was. So we see this sort of field littered with ambitious, failed, expensive projects. And I would predict that we're going to see something similar in BC. Because there's not clear evidence that they've thought through what it is it's actually going to do, and they have spurned the opportunities to discuss the issues with the public. In part, I think, because of this controversy that politicians and their staff and bureaucrats say, whoa, people might not like this, so we'll say nothing. This is what happened in Ontario when the Smart Card project was proposed 10 years ago. The minister would only come out and say something after they had been accused of being big brothers and say, we're not big brothers, trust us. But they never proposed, they never addressed squarely what the issues were. So while these ID schemes require us to trust in this infrastructure, the governments again and again and again have not provided the basis for developing that trust. In fact, they have not demonstrated that they trust their citizenry. They run and hide from their citizenry when it comes to these issues. And that is, I'd say, a toxic dynamic which we are seeing possibly quite repeated here. On the other hand, given that we have now this 5-year hiatus between the issuing of these and the turning on of these other features, perfect opportunity to examine those issues, to have a discussion, a provincial discussion about what do we want in a card, what are the risks, what are the opportunities, and put all the cards on the table, take up, so to speak, do the deep technical analyses, which may be over the heads of most people, but on the other hand, we can also have a discussion amongst ourselves about what we want ID to be and what are the risks and how is it going to affect us in our lives. And that is something that you can engage public in. And the government, if they do that sincerely, will develop the kind of trust and support and legitimacy that they are going to need in order to make this thing work. And if they're not going to follow in the path of all these other failed experiments. I'll have some more things to say in wrapping up about what I think might be done, but I just want to sort of put some of that out there as why the BC case right now is kind of interesting from a worldwide point of view in terms of a citizenry having the opportunity to engage with the development of a public identity infrastructure that we all both care about and depend on and will in many ways shape who we are as individuals and collectively as a society. So, thanks.
Thanks, all of you. I've got a couple of questions to get things rolling, general questions, about ID cards generally, because I'm treating this as an ID card, which is what it is. First question is, we've all at various points, governments have had what you call, what Chris called breeder documents, foundational documents. Those of us aged, such as myself, may remember crossing the Canada-U.S. border with a baptism certificate done in longhand by the parish priest. Now, shouldn't we have, in these modern times, where fewer and fewer of us are able to do that fancy joined-up kind of writing, don't we have to have something a little more secure, a little more high-tech, something that a high school kid can't just fake on the parish's letterhead? I'm just going to throw that open to everybody. Is there something between, and how close is the BC Services card to doing that?
Well, maybe I'll start. I mean, it's interesting that you talk about these sort of foundational documents. Many of us who've lived for decades, I mean, we still rely on these documents, and these are still foundational to the most high-tech forms of ID. You know, they can put all the RFID chips in there, the biometric facial recognition, which, you know, doesn't really work as well as it's claimed, but ultimately it comes back to how do you demonstrate who you are, based on birth certificates and other kinds of things. And this is one of the big flaws in arguing that ID is a solution to security problems. If you cannot make an ID that's more secure than the documents on which they're based, at least in terms of in that narrow sense. So, sure, we can improve the integrity of our documents. We can make them harder to forge, more durable, more convenient. There's no argument, I think, from any of us who would say that we shouldn't be looking at new techniques and thinking about what the opportunities, the technical capabilities that we have now. But let's not do that in a really stupid way. Let's not do that in a way, for instance, that if you're going to be innovative, then let's be innovative about the relationship between the citizens and government and their ID scheme, and not just insist on failed federated identity schemes, which is what we have. Let's pay attention to the Microsofts and the IBMs and the other scholars who are looking at user-centric ID. The fact that the provincial government appears not to have given that seriously is, I would say, is sort of conservative and backward-looking on their part. So many of us will be forward-looking.
Christian?
Yeah, just a little anecdote. What's interesting that, the new type of IDs I think we've seen, there's a lot of security and a lot of new mechanisms to protect the new type of IDs, but as mentioned, is like, what do you need to get this new ID? You need to present another one, typically. To get a passport, you show your driver's license, and what did you need to show to get your driver's license? So they rely, you might have shown your baptism certificate and all these things. So the primordial identity or whatever, the original one, might be easier to forge, and you can game the system this way. I'm actually pretty concerned because my house was actually robbed a month ago, and much to the dismay, they stole a big safe I had in my bedroom, which I did not bolt it down to the floor. Maybe I should have. So unfortunately for the thieves, they're going to find there was nothing in there except a couple of identity documents that I seldom use, including my birth certificate. So I'm a bit concerned what's possible of abuse they could do with that. They could maybe trigger some initial ID theft by providing that and get some more higher value documents with that. Fortunately, they're all in French, and the robbery happened in Washington, so hopefully it's going to be meaningless to them. But it's a bit. It's not just when you end up with a document, I think I'm kind of more comfortable with the security in the new type of documents, the new passports. I mean, they might have side effects, but their security is harder to clone. You need some electronic chops to be able to clone them, not just copying them. But how can you get these? Can you attack the lower level, the fallbacks, and getting real certificates or real credentials using invalid ones? So that's a concern for sure.
I'll
Michael?
Because I'll always chime in. I was thinking, I spent a lot of this week commenting about the passage of S7, which is the quite controversial sunsetted provisions of the anti-terrorism law that have been brought back, the preventative detention, etc. And, at some point in any interview, television, radio, or otherwise, that I did, the interviewer would feel obliged to ask the question, but is there nothing that shouldn't be done in the name of security? And I would say, well, yes, things that make us less secure in the name of security, right? Just because we have a security rationale doesn't mean that the actions that we're adopting are going to make us more secure. And so frequently we see this kind of, we keep being told we're putting all of your data in the center of the park with a tarp over it instead of in these insecure silos with this terribly insecure paper, right? We keep hearing this. In fact, what you can get away with in terms of compromising that data under the new secure systems is obviously and frequently less successfully protected than the old-fashioned ways that in many cases, simply put, you never, ever pulled a truck up to a clinic and walked away with 4 million patient files. You can do it on a memory stick now in the quote-unquote more secure system. So just because we use the language of security, the rationale of security, the motivation of security, doesn't mean that's in fact what we're going to get at the end of the day, which is why it's so important to really be very specific about what is the problem we're trying to solve. Because every solution we introduces a different set of problems, a different set of parameters, different attack surfaces, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of this discussion, it is very layered and complex. And just because we have a security motivation doesn't mean we're going to get more security. Yeah.
I wanted to add as well, just to highlight what Michael said earlier, which is that with the old care card, I love to say that, the old care card, anyways, we weren't using the security mechanisms that the government had designed into that card, the signature, and the potential PIN to protect your card. So why would the new security measures in the new BC Services card be any more successful? So a lot of the technology has to be accompanied by social practice. And the same people who were not checking the care card are going to be the ones who are also not going to be checking the photo, the biometric photo on the new services card or what have you. But the point is that just as Michael, and this underscores what Michael just said, is just adding more security stuff doesn't mean we're going to be secure.
Anybody else?
I'll just be quick because I know people want to ask questions. But I just want to point that security is effectively useless. and I mean it in this way. I can give you a safe, but why do you have a safe? There was a goal to protect something. But you have to define what you're protecting. What is the actual problem you're trying to resolve? In one case, we were trying to do something. There was a policy, protect, and there was an attempt to protect it. The alternate is, I just give you a safe, and we figure out things that the safe can do until we're happy that the safe is doing one of those things. It can act as a boat anchor. Maybe you have a boat. But we need to figure out what the policy for the identity systems is. This is where it's important to figure out the policy driver. How do we evaluate success? And not like it has this technical element. It's not that. What is the actual success for the program? Defined, delimited. How do we address if it doesn't meet it? And then, how is it possible to meet those policy drivers? So in the context of going across the border, which is what your initial example was, what is the policy that we want to achieve? And then what is the requisite level of security to enable that policy? And so when we're talking about security, it matters. It matters a lot. But what matters first is thinking through these problems. What is the problem? In political science, there's a huge, huge number of people that will tell you all sorts of solutions. That's one of the things that academics are good for. We have lots of solutions, and we'll find something that fits some problem that we invent that fits that solution. That isn't the best way to approach an identity system. And we should be much, much, much more mindful and have a comprehensive approach that looks at security, that looks at the policy, that looks at the actual problems we're facing, and address those first.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn the mic loose among you, with me attached to it. We heard some talk here today about how This is the first step of a national ID card. How is that going to come about? This is just one card for health and driver's license in one province. How is this going to turn into a national ID card?
Well, I think that I outlined those in my remarks earlier, but there's some key indications. One is that BC has been very involved in the development of the national policy for a countrywide integrated identity system. So it's not just that you can access federal government services online using your banking credentials. It's government-wide. And then the dream and the plan is to integrate the provinces, and possibly I even saw mention of municipalities, so that all government functions or service delivery could be interoperable via this one network. The other indication is that so in addition to helping author and joining a pilot project to that effect, BC has selected the same vendor as the feds, with the explicit goal that they want the provincial system to interoperate, not just technically, like, oh, so we're going to use the same guys because the government of Canada use these guys and they must be good. The province of BC specifically wants the British Columbia identity system to integrate and interoperate with the federal system. So what I've called it is a national ID card through a provincial back door. And I think that this is a big pilot project for a national ID card, so that the problem with a national ID card has been, getting the provinces to agree on anything. We've seen the kerfuffle this causes, and it's really like herding cats. So I'm calling BC the first customer, and BC will prototype and be the pioneer of this new card that interoperates on the federal level. And then all Secure Key Technologies has to do, with some help from the feds, is shop this success story around to the other provinces and say, see, look at how amazing it is. Look what BC did. And BC is very much proud of their track record on digital identity management. And they're bragging that they're cutting edge and a leader, and they won some awards at an industry conference last year. And so I think that those are all signs, and it's not, and on so many levels, people say, well, fantastic, how convenient, we'll love it. So I think it's fairly evident, although they deny it. I mean, in when in the policy documents, they often make specific mentions that, in no way does this, indicate that we're now or ever going to be implementing a national ID card, because this is, with the exception of immediately post 9/11 that I think Andrew's referring to, national ID cards in Canada have been very unpopular. And in part because we don't have a history, as other some European countries and other less democratic countries have histories with ID cards. And these are entitlement cards. So you think of apartheid South Africa, where you had to prove, that you were entitled to a certain treatment. But Canadians don't have the history, and quite frankly, there's this fear of function creep. So one day we have a very convenient card, a one-size-fits-all card that helps us access federal and municipal and provincial cards, and the next thing you know, it's mandated to carry at all times. And we don't, and then what's next? So this idea of function creep or slippery slope is one that Canadians have always been conscious of, I think.
Anybody else?
Well, again, with the caveat that I don't know much about the BC system, it's just, I guess, questions to be asked is how this card will be used. And from just what I've been hearing today, there's potential dangers I'm all for reusing an identity with as many services as possible to reduce the friction for users. But it's like how you do that is like the important thing. So if there is this unique number on the chip, and if that's the basis in which you identify yourself to all these services, then you have the danger of creating linkages between these silos that before were not linked. So if you do, and if by law they don't allow to share that data, when you introduce correlation handles between them, then you effectively link them. So I'm not saying that's what they're doing. I don't know if that's what they do. Maybe they do convert that number into domain-specific identifiers. There are ways, and some of the techniques I talked about earlier might be used for that. But I think that if indeed, because it makes sense, you develop a big system, pay up a lot of money, you want to have a good return on investment and reuse the card so that you don't carry 20 cards, in your wallet, as many of us have. So it's just important to figure out what's the best way to do that. And there's going to be this tendency to reuse what's existing.
So I won't go over what Kate said, but there's a few other elements that actually, one, tie to the vendor, and actually second, tie really nicely into Christian's remark about the law. So, hello? Is that, yeah. Okay, sorry. So I'm just going to talk about the vendor briefly and then comment back on Christian's remarks about law and policy. So why do we think this might be a national ID card? So to begin with, you can look at federal documents, and actually the report that BCCLA will put out, it goes through a lot of those. And it identifies how there's a history that's built up over the past 5 or 10 years. And they build on each other to explain this is how an identity card system would work, and this is why it's important. And there's an effort to try and work this out. Although something that's interesting is we see the privacy protections seem to become diminished in each version. So at the national level, the federal level, there's interest in some sort of interoperability to make federal services more available. Now, where it gets interesting is those are documents on their own, and all governments have all sorts of documents of all types, and you should be skeptical of all of them because most of them will not come to be. However, we have a policy community at the federal level that also has key actors from the province that are also province of British Columbia who are also participating. And then we also have a vendor who's providing the federal services and is now providing the provincial services. And indeed, in the 2013 documents that BC FIPA extracted from the government after a considerable amount of time, we find that SecureKey does have this mission, this aim, this corporate ethos of wrapping up Canada. And so their aim is to provide cross-Canada identity services. And in fact, in early back and forth, there was debate as to what the card should be named. So it's being titled, of course, the BC Services Card. All the advertising slogans are BC Services Card. But initially it was proposed calling it the SecureKey card because it was theirs, and they had an argument that they would be able to offer lower prices and aggregate data in a slightly different way. So this is very much a project that is driven by or strongly influenced, I don't want to say driven, influenced by a particular corporate actor. And there's an interest, and they want to sell their product. Now, with regards to the notion of, well, but we have laws that limit how some data can go between different parties, and that's entirely true. The challenge, however, is that in the initial trials of what is now the BC Services Card, ICBC raised warning flags. And so there's a research clause in privacy law in British Columbia saying you can do certain things with information so long as it's for research purposes only. So a whole lot of data was being used for quote-unquote research purposes from ICBC's databases to trial the card. And their managers were very concerned that it was outside the scope of whether they could conduct this research. Now, they had to change the law anyways for the card, but one of the solutions that was noted in the documents was, well, we're just going to change the law and then it'll be okay. And so the danger with, I hate to sound, I'm a political scientist, so if the legislature passes something, it's formally democratically legitimated, but we have a system whereby if it's law that guides how you can share, and we have a government that has shown a willingness to change law in order to facilitate the card in the first place, there's a flag that goes up. Will they be willing to further change the law in partnership with the federal government or other provinces to then continue data sharing across other jurisdictions? And that's why I like to almost think of it as a proto-pan-Canadian identity card, because like most things proto, they don't work. I suspect, along with Andrew, that it will fall on itself and collapse inwards, but it doesn't necessarily. And so there are indications that this is indeed where it could go, and there are actors that want it to go there. Whether they're successful is very much up for debate.
Thank you for your patience, sir. It's over to you now.
Hello, I'm Nathaniel Christopher. I'm covering this for Extra, Canada's Gay and Lesbian News. My question is very specific. A lot of people living with HIV, of course there's a very high prevalence of HIV among the gay community, have very serious concerns about disclosure of their personal health information to different parties that could affect their housing, their employment, and so forth. So I guess my question is to all of you, how this may impact people, for example, living with a highly stigmatized condition like HIV.
I can jump in there. The BC Services Card, I think, is really not an issue in terms of health information at the kind of level that you're discussing. But certainly e-health and the other aspects of what we were discussing in transformational government truly are. And in terms of British Columbia, in comparison with the rest of the country, we have seen some of the most vociferous patient pushback on e-health and the data sharing initiatives because of the involvement of the HIV positive community and the AIDS community of British Columbia. They have really driven the small numbers of patient controls that we have built into the e-health system. So like we have PharmaNet, we have an ability to lock down your PharmaNet records if you know that such an ability exists. We also have an ability related to laboratory tests, which very often will have not only HIV test results, but a raft of information relating to HIV treatment. We have the ability to lock those down because of the advocacy of the HIV positive community here, because of patient advocacy. The government has been adamant that they will not tell anybody about those controls. And this is part of the problem when it keeps getting raised, right? What is the problem? What is the system? How do we remedy it? How do we get security, right? How do you get security of your own personal information to lock it down when, one, you don't know that it's just flown into the public repository, and two, if you do find that out, you're not going to be able to know how to lock it down because nobody's going to tell you, right? So these are some of the systems, but feel free to disagree with me if you think differently. But the services card in and of itself doesn't really have a huge impact on the mountain, as I put it. This is kind of a piece on that, but the e-health system writ large is of great concern to the community, all kinds of patient communities. But the HIV positive community has been a leader in some pushback on that, but not related to the services card because it's not really as implicated as these other systems. You're welcome.
So I want to be very clear up front. That this is the hypothetical kind of use of this card. So we've talked about access controls. And so the idea is individuals will only have access to information when they need it. So when you're accessing a service, that's when information is disclosed. But we've raised in our reports the idea of function creep. And so my worry, and this isn't just true of the HIV community, but any community, is that is a part of a routine police encounter. So you get pulled over or something, or information. The services card does not build a centralized database. It is meant at some point to provide a means by which you can access a series of databases prospectively if you have a need to access them. So if there's a need to access a health database and an educational database and an other database simultaneously for some service provision, a law enforcement action, you're gaining access to ambulance services, whatever the case may be. In that case, more information may be disclosed to the service operator that you're engaging with than is true today. And that's because right now, you can't cross-reference those systems easily. This card will allow the person at the end that you're interacting with to potentially access a series of services as they may need to, defined by the government. So in the case of, I know more about mental health because that's where I spend a little bit more time working with colleagues in. So you can imagine a situation where the police pull you over in a mental health instance. They run your card. It just doesn't come up what you have, just that you have a history of violent behavior in addition to your parking tickets. And all of a sudden it changes the way that the government, or that the officer may treat you. So this is the sort of function creep worry, is how right now, as Brad appropriately mentioned, this isn't where it is now. But in our interviews, this is where they want to go. This is the aim of accessing multiple databases simultaneously as appropriate for the service. And then it comes down to a question of what's appropriate, what's the service, and does that individual need to know or should they know?
We have to be careful, though. We have to be careful using hypothetical worst-case scenarios. Our primary focus when we were looking at the way that the government has currently set this up is to be certain that we're comfortable with exactly those any sharing that would occur. So these decisions wouldn't happen in a vacuum. They would be run through the lens of the lawful authority the government has or doesn't have, and they would be run through our role as an oversight, as having oversight as a regulator. So, I think it's possibly we have to be aware of a worst case scenario, but we have to be really careful not to let that become the thing that we're talking about, because that isn't where it is now.
I could chime in, though, and say, because apparently I am, and say we're a lot closer to the worst case scenario in a number of places regarding how the new vision of the use of databases is going. And let me give you an example, because we get complaints on a daily basis, right? If you want to access social housing, the form that you may be looking at will ask for a disclosure waiver for your medical records. Why on earth would you provide your medical records? Well, I'll tell you, because I used to be a qualified disability assessor. But what you want to know is not what is the diagnosis. What you want to know is, can you walk up 8 steps, right? There's a functional disability assessment that's needed, but your medical records are not how you get there. And yet we have a potentially well-meaning notion that instead of letting people speak for themselves, their data shadow, the government's access to the database will tell us what we need to know. We don't want to talk to you, sister, brother. We want to access your information. Just give us the waiver, because the database will explain to us. So this is a kind of governmental logic that has really got tremendous momentum. And we're seeing it all the time. Inappropriately accessing databases for getting what is not completely irrelevant information, but so far afield and so far abroad of what is actually required, that I think, from my perspective, I want to say we're a little farther down the road in terms of a mentality of how we use databases in terms of government services. Although acknowledging, as you say, we don't want to take the hypothetical, in both hands, gripping it. But if we're going to look at what does today tell us about what's tomorrow, I just think we're a little farther down the road than we are. And certainly, just to add to the notion of the legitimacy of what does the legislation provide access to, I make this point all the time because it's so frustrating. The government will say, we will abide by all applicable privacy legislation. Why does no one put up their hand and say, who makes that privacy legislation? Because, of course, it's, well, we do, right? This is like saying, I will abide by all the rules I set for myself. I promise you, and if you don't believe me, just ask me, right? This is, in fact, the case. So, honestly, and I'm a huge fan and flow much power to the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner for drawing some lines in the sand. But when it comes to these issues, the governmental database issue of which this is a part, really what it's going to come down to, I'm sorry to say, is a constitutional challenge. Because it's one thing to say we have statutory laws, it's going to be another thing to say whether this access to increasing amounts of information as the government sees fit is actually constitutional. And we haven't got to that drawing of the line yet. So the question is not what does the government think that it should be accessing. The question is what does the Constitution say we have a right to protection from that encasement.
And this is an interesting, it's an important thing to keep in mind. again, we go back to basic privacy principles. One of the basic privacy principles is that you collect the minimal amount of information necessary for the purpose that you're collecting it, assuming that your purpose is legitimate. And the example you gave, where we want to know what your condition is so we can determine whether you can go up the stairs rather than just asking if you can go upstairs. We see this, and this is something that we all have to keep in mind, and we have to trust. We can't trust that the question we're being asked is actually a question that is collecting the minimal amount necessary. It's quite common for people to ask for your date of birth when what they really need is your age. Mm-hmm. And those are very different in the level of sensitivity that those two pieces of information have. One is close to a foundational piece of information that you can use to get access to other things, and the other one is just whether or not you're old enough to drink or smoke or what have you. And this is something that we all have to be aware of. We have to be aware of it when we walk into a pet store and they tell us that they need to have our area code so that we can get the discount on the scratching post, and we have to be aware, when we're walking into a landlord's office to fill out an application. And if you just keep in mind that nobody is authorized to collect more than the minimal amount of information if it's government than is necessary. If it's private sector, then the standard is reasonable. And we all have to sort of take responsibility because sometimes people don't realize even that they're dealing with a privacy issue.
Okay, we have another question back here.
I work in part of a system that Canada's Prime Minister calls a back office function, which will be modernized someday soon. In that, not in the same department that I'm in, but because of connections between technological connections, the pressure is pretty high to monetize the kinds of data sources that are available through these government-gathered functions. So I think it's great that I'm so glad to hear all of what people have said this afternoon. And there isn't time for talk of data mining, but that's a huge pressure on all sides. And if we look at the ways in which the provincial and federal governments and even municipal governments are using common assets to balance their budgets, we can think of the pressure of the very valuable information, the very valuable commodity, which is information. So that's something to think about, and I would just wonder if anybody on the panel recognizes this book that came out probably 10 years ago at least, and it was probably 20 years in the making, and it was reissued last year. It had to do with the origins of information technology and then how it was related to the census. Does that ring a bell at all? Or the Hollerith system? Or the Hollerith programming? Okay, basically I encourage you to read it. It's called IBM and the Holocaust.
Yeah, right here. Green shirt.
Hello, thanks very much for all of you putting this on. It's a very useful thing. I guess what I'm wondering, I know we're all trying to look to how can we go forward from where we are. But as I hear people across the panel and around the room talking, is this really an opportune time for public discussion, or is the horse already out of the barn? When we look at the modus operandi that is going on in government these days, and hearing bureaucrats in government, their thinking is absolutely what they're saying. People might not like this, so we won't say anything. But we will keep doing something. And at the same time as we're highlighting that we're coming up to 20 years of the fundamental privacy law, which is information can only be on a need-to-know basis, you have to look at the fact that, as important as it is to have a Commissioner of Privacy office, they have not held the feet of government to the fire, in the fact that the systems that are in place now expose workers to information that they do not have any need to know. So you know, when you're building these systems, they haven't been built on the fundamental principle of the law we have in place right now. Allowing the government to carry on putting out a card that has a unique identifier on it because they haven't yet told us what they're going to do with it, we are already on that slippery slope. As everyone here has said, it's not what they're doing with it today that's the issue, so much as the infrastructure that this will allow them to key into very fast. So I think there, you know, I am seeing a bit of a divide here between what the way that the authorities and the watchdogs can actually hold the government's feet to the fire, and we're seeing a government, not just provincially but federally, that takes the attitude is people won't like it if we tell them, so let's not tell them, let's roll it out and hope they don't see it till it's too late.
Very certainly that was the strategy behind the development of the BC Services Card, the lack of transparency, almost bordering on secrecy, and the obfuscation of research efforts. And imagine if you were just a citizen and not somebody who's being paid to do the research and make these requests. So I think you've definitely hit it. But I just want to say one brief thing in that when I finally did speak with this one representative from the Office of the Chief Information Officer, and I said, you know, the story has changed. The story is not about the BC Services Card. The story is about why we can't get information about the BC Services Card. And he got flustered and he said, oh, well, you know, we are. And I said, well, why aren't you talking? Why do I have to file freedom of information requests? Why can't I interview you? Why can't you just tell me? And he said, because people are afraid. And by people, he meant the people working on the card project. So I think that is very telling.
I think the commissioner agrees. That's why she says that when we take these next steps, we have to consult. We have to consult with the public. There's really not. It's an interesting discussion that we had. Do we, when we are evaluating the card, take a list of 5 and 10 years down the road potential objectives or uses for the card and evaluate these hypothetical scenarios where there is nothing that we can point to and evaluate? Or do we evaluate where it is at now and whether or not it's being done in a privacy-sensitive way? And so we can't really object to something that doesn't exist. What we can say is that before we take the next step, the step that you're concerned about, the step that everybody at the panel is concerned about, it's important that there be a meaningful consultation with the public, both on whether or not what the purpose of the card is and whether or not we're going to be achieving it in a way that is appropriate and meaningful. So I think the commissioner completely agrees with you. We have to. This discussion should have happened before. But being that it didn't, has to happen at this point, and we'll see what government we have in a couple of months from now. But the government we had up until Parliament was prorogued said that they were going to give us that meaningful consultation.
You have a question?
Can I just add one quick comment? Sorry, this will be very quick. I just wanted to point out that the history of these systems, as Andrew pointed out, shows that they can be implemented. Cards can be in people's pockets. And the politics of the day can reverse things. This happened in the UK in an incredibly dramatic and very expensive manner. It cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds, but it was reversed. And so there is a danger, a threat that people sort of see when the infrastructure is built, it necessarily will continue. And indeed, there's a better chance it will, but it's not necessary. It can be reversed. So this isn't like, it's a done deal, throw up our hands, and how do we go forward with the card? There is still room for a reversal of policy. But really what's important there is that it becomes a political issue and not just something that's sort of back and forth in back rooms in government.
Yeah.
I have some practical questions about the card. So the ID that it's replacing is the health card and the driver's license combined, right?
Not quite. You can still keep your ICBC issued standalone driver's license, but when you go to renew your license, if it's in any time in the next 5 years, well, it will be, they will ask you, do you want to add the services card to your driver's license? So you can marry your health card to your driver's license, or you can keep them separately. So you just, but where you go to get your new health card is ICBC, where you would also go to get your driver's license.
Okay, so that's why that says this is not a driver's license, because that one isn't a combined one.
That's just the services card.
Okay, and this gentleman was talking about the card getting read. It sounded like you were talking about it getting read accidentally. And also for you, because I don't know if he's going to take the mic away, he said something about a number that you could still use the card even if it wasn't valid, but you could use it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So with regards to the read range, so these are designed to. So when engineers build something, it's how ought it be used and how ought it be used reliably. So it should be used, and you should be able to read it from 5 to 10 centimeters away. So effectively, if you wave it over, the portal back to your phone or a device in a hospital or something like that. Security researchers have many years ago demonstrated that you can increase the read range to about 50 meters. And so it enables someone, when you just walk past, to extract the number from the card. Now, what I meant when I said that you can get an NFC chip, you can buy them, and if you have access, if you're in the business of making very high quality fraudulent IDs, you won't necessarily be able to develop the cryptographic proofing, the proof to the government that, hey, this is totally a legitimate card. But you can embed the number from your card. And so the chip is invalid. The government won't like it. But it creates an other layer of, well, I don't know why it's wrong, but the number's right and everything else is right, so what do we do? Something that ICBC actually raised in a somewhat related vein, not to the card itself, or not to the chip itself, is if you do choose to get a combined card, a services card and driver's license, ICBC was very mindful, and I want to really point out that they have been, from the documents we read, they have been very mindful of the privacy implications. They noted that it also means that when you show your driver's license, you'll be showing your health number, because that number will still be embedded on the card. And so when you're going to an airport or something like that and you're showing your driver's license to get on a plane, there will be the opportunity for more information to be seen on the card just by nature of sort of the backup mechanism. Because obviously if the card isn't working, the province has an interest obviously in still providing you the medical service that you need. And so the backup at the moment will be to emboss or to print your health number on your driver's license as well. So a combined card will have more information on it now in addition to the chip.
Another question over here.
I just wanted to expound the point about making this political point of discussion. When the care card came out in 1989, it replaced an old paper-based number, MSP number, that was directly tied to the social insurance number of yourself, and it was changed. Whenever you changed your name, you got a new MSP number, and so the people of the day decided that that wasn't a good idea to have this social. We already had the card, and we got rid of it, and we got a care card, which was meant to separate those two concerns in a more meaningful way. So just something to bring up is that the care card. But also the care card came in with these supposed future benefits that we would be able to use that, you pointed out that we're currently not using. So I'm just curious. We haven't seen any of this roll out on the front lines yet. So we don't know what to do with these cards yet. And when someone presents for a prescription or when someone presents for healthcare, we don't have the readers. We never had the readers to read the barcodes that were systematically implemented and given to us. They originally came with expiration dates. Care cards used to come with expiration dates. They never actually expired. So a lot of these features that they build, they don't end up using, although the fear is there that they can. So those are the kinds of things I just wanted to bring up, is that there may be a leap to thinking about how this could nefariously be used. But I don't think they're that well put together. I think this is really how can we save money by reducing 2 cards to 1. I don't think they've even gotten beyond that themselves. Just put those things out there.
Yeah, I call that the natural blonde syndrome. Yep, natural blonde. That's what it said on the box. There's a bunch of folks at the back. A bunch of folks at the back. Oh.
Just a simple, quick question. If you have the option of having the driver's license separated from the health card, will they be, do you foresee that they will be twisting your arm to combine them by saying you've got to not only pay for your driver's license, but pay for the health card as well?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't put anything past how the card could be used in the future. What I also wonder about is like it may just strictly not be an option anymore to keep them separate. So right now we can. That's what we say in the report. Right now it's optional to keep the 2 cards separate, but there's no telling. I wanted to make a point. The Privacy Commissioner, when she evaluated the services card, she did find that it was in keeping with all the laws, privacy legislation. But what our report shows is how 3 different laws were changed in order to accommodate the BC Services Card, and there's nothing. So of course it's legal. You know, what can the Privacy Commissioner say other than that? It's legal because the government made it so. So it's important to remember that. That's why building in privacy protections into the actual technology is so crucial, and not strictly relying on policy or regulation to preserve our privacy rights.
One more question. I think we're running out of...
way back was trying. You have a card?
Oh.
About preventing people to steal chips information using card reader. Do you think just by folding aluminum, pressing card inside will prevent them to read?
It certainly helps. Something that actually Andrew Clement and some of the research he's done and pulled out, they tested RFID blockers or pulled up research on it. And there's all sorts of things to show that the pristine card that you used to get, at least with the enhanced driver's license, I don't know if they still provide them, was reasonably reliable when you first got it. But over time, it degrades in your wallet. And so is it effective? Yes, it helps. Is it, as it gets back to what I said about security, security isn't about perfect. It increases the challenge, but it isn't sort of the perfect panacea necessarily. But certainly it's the best thing that you could do to prevent reading at the moment in an easy fashion.
Sir, you're going to have the privilege of the last question. Oh, okay. Well, then you will have the privilege of the last question because we're running out of time.
Great. I saw there was some article on the CBC News the other night about people flashing a phone app to grab credit card information. And my thought was that they could grab the information of the card, of this card as well.
They can. The key thing, as I mentioned earlier, is when you capture that information, you'll get the number, which is unencrypted, but that doesn't mean that you can then necessarily use the number in an effective manner, because that number is one of 2 keys. You have the number, and then that's used deeper in the government database. But before you even get that far, there's a test, a cryptographic test, to see, okay, is the chip that you've put that number into, is it generating the right kind of cryptographic signature? And if it doesn't generate that signature, then the number doesn't go any further in the government database. And so my point is that putting that number in a fake ID tries to add legitimacy, but it doesn't make the chip work because you still have to go through the cryptographic proofing. But yes, it's feasible to use its equivalent technology.
Okay, well, you've been lovely. Those have been great questions, and the panel will be sticking around afterwards, so if we didn't get to you, grab them before they go. But now it's over to Andrew Clement to sum all this up.
Yeah, well, thank you. I hesitate to take on the challenge of trying to do justice to the many excellent presentations and the good questions, and particularly for a topic that is so broad in scope, and I'd say in the long term so consequential. So I'll make a few observations, and I'd welcome any reactions that you might have, and I'll try and be brief about this. I guess the thing that strikes me, and return to a point that I made at the beginning, that I think that the BC is at a very interesting point right now with the prospect of a card and a ID infrastructure that is getting built behind a transformation in the card, in a way to do it sort of right, or at least to do it a lot better than previous jurisdictions have done and what we've seen so far. I think it's interesting that it's been framed in terms of privacy issues. Of course it is, and fortunately we have, as a regulator here in the Commission, the Privacy Commissioner, Information and Privacy Commissioner, the call for public consultation. And I think that is the key element here. Not so much that that the current card is necessarily that privacy risky, but rather about the process by which the important decisions are being made and done so much out of the public scene. And so in a way, I would say it's more represents a political crisis and opportunity rather than a privacy one at this point. I don't think we have to rely on anticipating future worst case scenarios, although they do play a role. I think we could look now at whether the proposed changes in the card and now that are being implemented actually reflect a legitimate process. And I think there's some very serious questions about that. The lack of information in its own, just on that own basis, draws question to the degree to which the proposals, the scheme can enjoy our trust. And I think that there's a role here for citizens and for advocacy organizations such as the BCCLA and BC FIPA to play a leadership role in drawing our attention to the way in which we should have a role in our governance. The privacy commissioners, as regulators, are, as we've now been made several points been made several times, are bound by the laws that they have, that they inherit in a way that they have to implement. And I think that what we see in Canada, other provinces, and in other jurisdictions that rely on privacy commissioners is that we tend to leave to the privacy commissioners, well, they're taking care of this. They're handling the privacy dimension. We don't have to worry about it so much. And of course, we can't worry about everything. But time and again, we see that the privacy regimes are not adequate for dealing with the challenges of these new ID schemes. I want to respond to a couple of the points that came out in the questions. So that are related to this. Is the horse out of the barn, was asked. Is it too late? Well, there has been a long history, now decades since the 1960s, of when the first privacy laws were brought in, of how privacy regulation has actually allowed for the enormous expansion of data collection. In a way, it has facilitated the data appetite of governments and corporations. And we are seeing in this development, I would say, a further move in that. The question that was asked by the back office worker who's concerned about the origins of the data keeping systems and the attraction now for governments to monetize the information that is being collected. We're seeing a model emerging in terms of government operations, and I would say these ID schemes in particular, where the data collection that's being done is looking more and more like what is being done now on the web, where the free services or the government services are underwritten by the trafficking in that information and the reselling and the packaging of that. And so we see an alliance here between governments and corporations under a regime of neoliberalism, where the role of the citizen is treated as that of a customer, and the governments rely increasingly on using that data as a way of underwriting their own costs. And I think that is, in the long term, that is a challenge that for our privacy commissions, I don't think our privacy commissioners and our laws are adequate for dealing with that kind of impetus when it is linked to digital network technologies. We have to develop a new modes of politics around personal information and identity and privacy. And I think in the case of the BC Services Card, what that would look like is holding to account Secure Key, the government, the Office of the Information, the CICO, and not simply relying on, well, is our personal information protected, but rather have they made the case that warrants our trust in their handling that. And I think that is a shift that we need to make in terms of privacy and wider civil liberties advocacy. So I think that is the opportunity. If that can be done, then I think that the BC case actually might be very helpful across Canada as it confronts the imperatives to create these integrated, harmonized information systems across provincial and federal jurisdictions. And if it can be treated in those sort of broad terms, but also brought home to the ways in which our own daily interactions are bound up by those cards, the databases, and that in order for us to accept those changes, we need the onus is on those organizations that are promoting them, rather than us as just diligent data protectors of our own. If the onus is shifted, then I think we could see a much more positive dynamic, and then we can develop sophisticated, user-centric identity infrastructures that will actually serve us well and will reflect a kind of governance in a network society. Otherwise, I think that it will be a continuing rearguard action in which we will look and think of ourselves and get treated increasingly as customers, and then our value becomes, to what degree can we provide revenue or political support, and that's it. So that's a little bit depressing, perhaps, but also I think that there is in there a basis for hope and an imaginative reimagining of how in a contemporary network society we can have our citizenship and our ID schemes that reflect that well. So that's my little closing rant. I'd be very happy to afterwards to take any other questions or discuss this. This is something that all of us up here devote our lives to, and so this is an ongoing conversation. So thank you.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Andrew Clement. So I think the key takeaway from today is that it's not too late. And as difficult and as uphill the road might be toward an identity policy in BC that reflects the democratic values that British Columbians and others living here truly hold, that we can certainly, it's an election for one thing. You all have representatives, and certainly this would be a very interesting topic to raise with those who are vying for office. And the public consultation is coming up, and I think we've all perhaps have a task in that we participate and ensure that what the government has promised it will do in terms of consulting broadly and meaningfully with the public on the type of identity policy, and not just the card itself, but what kind of identity policy do British Columbians want and deserve. So this is the conclusion, not just of our workshop today, but of my project that was almost a year in the making of this report and this research project. So I want to say thank you so much to BCCLA, who offered me so much support during that time, particularly Micheal Vonn. Andrew Clement was also a consultant on the project, my co-author Christopher Parsons, and so many other people helped make today and the report possible. And I want to particularly acknowledge the staff of BCCLA and the staff here today who helped put on a phenomenal event, and some of them are standing there. So thank you to everyone who helped. And thanks to our amazing panel. I do have these small tokens of our appreciation, which I'll give to you in a bit. But I do want to invite everyone here to join us. We have a nice little spread, a reception. There's a cash bar and some free food, so that's always nice. And the panel, most of us will be hanging around chit-chatting. So please do stay, have a drink, and continue the conversation. Regarding the report, it wasn't printed because it was not quite ready, but it is available on the BCCLA's website. There's a password protect. Is Charlotte coming up to tell about that? No. Okay. Well, if anybody needs to access it between now and next week desperately, we can arrange for that. Otherwise, it will be going up on our website, available for free download next week, and it will be printed as well. So there will be hard copies also available. And of course, some of you have photocopies of the technical review authored by Chris Parsons and Adam Molnar, and that is also available on our website, which is bccla.org. And I think we've ended 4 minutes ahead of time, which is simply a miracle for something like this. So thank you again to you, the audience, for coming and listening and sharing your questions and thoughts, and then hopefully we can talk a little more further.